The Dallas Cowboys are frauds. Well, that's at least what the media is going to tell you. But let me actually answer that. Are the Dallas Cowboys contenders or are they frauds? Through 9 weeks this year, they are 5-3, with their 5 wins coming up against the New York Giants, the New York Jets, the Patriots, the LA Chargers, and the LA Rams. And their 3 losses have come from the Arizona Cardinals, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Philadelphia Eagles. I think there's a bit of a disparity there between the wins and the losses. Obviously, the teams they have lost to have been really good teams outside of Arizona, whereas the 5 teams they have beaten, most of those teams are really bad. Currently, the Giants, the Rams, and the Patriots all have 3 wins or less, and they're obviously not the same teams that they used to be. The LA Chargers is actually a really good win looking at it in hindsight, because over the course of their last, I want to say 6 games, they've won the majority of them, and they've been going up against some pretty good teams, so you got to give credit to the LA Chargers. They look like they're kind of turning their season around, so that's a good win for the Dallas Cowboys, but they only beat them by 3. Granted, it was a game where the Dallas Cowboys basically dominated them from start to finish. It just sort of happened that it was only a 3-point victory. Their other really good win was against the New York Jets all the way back in week 2. The problem with that win is that the New York Jets have such an anemic offense that it doesn't really look impressive that they gave up only 10. But the fact of the matter is the Dallas Cowboys offense still looks good against a really good New York Jets defense. So where do we really stand with the Dallas Cowboys right now? Well, I think it's very obvious that this team is one of the best teams in the entire NFL. If you look at the Dallas Cowboys statistically, they're one of the most impressive teams in my opinion, because offensively they're averaging 27.5 points a game, which is ranked number 3 in the league. They average 346.5 yards per game, which would rank them number 10. And defensively, this is one of the better units as well. They rank 6th in points allowed. They rank 3rd in opponents' yards per game allowed. And we already knew this stuff about the Dallas Cowboys. Statistically, every single year, they're pretty good. It's just usually a big discrepancy against who they beat versus who they lose to. And that's kind of been the theme for them over the course of about the last 3-4 years. The Cowboys will dominate the bad teams, but they kind of struggle against the really good teams. Now, with that being said, Dallas can go out there and beat some good teams. We've seen this Dallas team go in there and beat a team like Philadelphia. Because when you look at the roster that this Dallas Cowboys team has, they can basically stack up with almost any team in the entire NFL. They have superstars like CeeDee Lamb, Tyron Smith, Zach Martin. I think Dak Prescott's a top 10 quarterback, so I think he's in that category as well. You also got defensive players like Trayvon Diggs, hopefully he gets back healthy. Deron Bland is playing like a superstar right now. Micah Parsons, DeMarcus Lawrence, all those studs on that defense. So this is not a team that sort of lacks the talent. And I think coaching-wise, I think Mike McCarthy's done a pretty good job this year. Now, I've watched every single Dallas Cowboys game because they're sort of a team that I'm extremely interested in. And I think for the most part, Mike McCarthy's done a decent job with this team. Ever since that first year where Dak Prescott broke his leg, this team has been continuously one of the best teams in the entire NFL. They've usually won over 12 games a year, and I do think that trend will continue on to this year. It just happens that every single time they've made the playoffs over the course of the last couple of seasons, they've met up with some really good teams that they just can't beat. Mainly in the last 2 years, it's been the San Francisco 49ers, but in years past, it was teams like Green Bay. And that's obviously the biggest concern for this Dallas team because this is a team that should be contending now. And if you're Dallas, if you can't beat these really good teams, you're never going to actually be able to get to being where you want to be. This is a Dallas Cowboys team that has a window size of about 4 years at this point. So if this team doesn't win the championship within the next 4 years, they're kind of screwed. Because Dak Prescott's only getting older. He actually sits at 30 years old right now. Their offensive linemen in Zach Martin, Tyron Smith probably only have 2 to 3 years left in them. A guy in DeMarcus Lawrence probably as well also only has 3 to 4 years left. And sure, these are guys that you can find replacements for and still be able to contend for championships. But let's be honest, a 34-year-old Dak Prescott that doesn't have the same ability that he does now, is he really going to be good enough to win a championship? I don't know. This Dallas Cowboys team right now definitely has some holes to it, but I think they're good enough to go in there and win a championship if I'm being honest with you. But let's actually talk about these holes that they do have a little bit, because I do think it is worth noting that they actually do have some problems. For starters, let's talk about Terrence Steele. Now, for the most part this year, he's actually been relatively decent. I wouldn't say he's been a top 10 right tackle, but I would say he's probably been within a top 20 right tackle. And I think he's done a decent job of protecting Dak Prescott, but he got exposed last night against the Philadelphia Eagles. On the day, he gave up, I think, about 4 sacks. And sure, not all of them were his fault. Some of them were on Dak, some of them were on the pressure from other sides. But nonetheless, he was giving up over 10 pressures in the game and multiple sacks. Obviously, not the game you want to have, especially against a division rival like the Philadelphia Eagles that they're going to have to face sometime this year again. Now, Terrence Steele is a big dude, and he's coming off, I want to say, a torn ACL, but he's been playing every single game this year, so at this point in his season, he should be fully up to date. But when it came to Philadelphia, they were absolutely killing him with these swim moves and also their speed rushes. And if you're a team like Philadelphia, who again, you have to play Dallas later in the season, but you also might face them in the playoffs, playoffs, you sort of are going to look at Terrence Steele and put up guys like Nolan Smith and Hassan Reddick, those guys who are super fast, they're going to expose him. Another one of the holes this Dallas Cowboys team has been their receiver 2, receiver 3 problem. Now, if you look at the bare roster, you'd actually think that Michael Gallup and Brandon Cooks are great players. And in all due respect, I would kind of tend to agree with you guys. Brandon Cooks has been a 1,000-yard receiver multiple times throughout his entire career, and Michael Gallup has been a pretty consistent third option for Dak Prescott with guys like Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. But this year, it's been a whole different story. On the year, Brandon Cooks only has 17 catches for 165 yards. And through this part in the season, he only has one game with 49 yards. Everything else is less than that. And in the 2 tough games they faced this year against the 49ers and the Philadelphia Eagles, he's had 1 catch for 7 yards in both games. So in these big games, he's not stepping up to give Dak Prescott another throwing option. And the same thing can honestly be said about Michael Gallup as well. On the year, Michael Gallup has 22 catches for 243 yards. And he's been at times almost unplayable. And it's weird because Michael Gallup is a very capable receiver. There have been multiple times this year where he's made extremely tough catches that are really impressive. But I honestly think that Michael Gallup is starting to become more into his own head, because last night against the Philadelphia Eagles, he had a game-changing drop that honestly might have lost the Cowboys the game. I love Michael Gallup. I've watched him throughout his entire career, even in college, and I truly do believe that he can be a good receiver in the NFL. But his problem is that he is not really much of a route runner, and that's kind of been the case his whole career. Michael Gallup is really good at one-on-one jump balls as well as running after the catch, but at this point this year, he hasn't really gotten a whole lot of opportunities with those jump balls, and he also hasn't done a whole lot when he's gotten the ball in his hands in the first place. At this point in the season, Jalen Tolbert is starting to get more snaps, and I think honestly that's probably the right move to make. Now, defensively, this team does not have a bunch of holes. I would say if they have any holes, is at the linebacker position and at corner. Deron Bland has been one of the best stories in the entire NFL. He has definitely done more than enough to replace a guy in Trevon Diggs. The problem is that their cornerback 2, Stephon Gilmore, has not looked like the Stephon Gilmore that we've seen in years past. Now, Gilmore is definitely one of those older corners, so I didn't expect him to come in here and just be a total shutdown type of guy. But if you watched against AJ Brown last night, he was kind of getting torched at times. Now, Gilmore is definitely not a terrible corner by no means, and it's not like he's getting picked on by these quarterbacks, which was a huge problem for Dallas last year, where their cornerback 2 was getting picked on the entire season. So it's at least nice to say that Gilmore hasn't been necessarily getting picked on, but it definitely hasn't been a great solution. He's definitely not been anything special, and I definitely do think that Dallas should have potentially made that trade for Jalen Johnson. As it goes for linebacker, Leighton Vander Esch is out with, I want to say, a neck injury. Hopefully he can come back soon, because he does offer sort of a veteran presence in that linebacking room, because currently Damone Clark is their starting linebacker to go along with Marquise Bell, and while Marquise Bell has looked like honestly a really good linebacker, he definitely does have his limitations in the run game, because he's a small, slender linebacker, so getting off blocks is just not one of his specialties. But the dude has speed, he has good coverage abilities. I like his future in the NFL. As it goes for Damone Clark, he's kind of the same as Leighton Vander Esch, but a lot worse. He's just kind of a mid linebacker. Sometimes he'll make some really nice special plays, but for the most part, he's just kind of there, and at times it's kind of hard to see that he's doing anything special. But let's move on from some of the negatives and start talking about some of the positives, and then at the very end, I'll let you guys know whether or not I think this team is a true contender or a true fraud. For starters, one of the better bright spots in this team has been Dak Prescott. Now, if you looked around the national media, you would think that Dak Prescott has thrown 20 interceptions this year, which, by the way, Dak Prescott has never in his entire career been an interception merchant outside of last year. In fact, he's been one of the better quarterbacks at not throwing interceptions, so I've always thought that that kind of narrative was really silly. Another narrative that I've heard about Dak Prescott is that he gets a bunch of garbage stats, and that's basically them saying that he stat pads his numbers, which I also think is just a bunch of garbage as well. On the year, Dak Prescott has 2,000 passing yards for 13 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, and if you take away his game against the 49ers, he only has 2 interceptions in the past 7 games. So this is a guy who's been able to take care of the ball and also be able to move the ball down the field really effectively. His completion percentage is at 70.2%, which is one of the best in the entire NFL. And these past 3 games, Dak Prescott has looked special. Last night against the Philadelphia Eagles, Dak Prescott stepped up in a huge way, which, by the way, doesn't shock me because Dak Prescott has always been good against this Philadelphia Eagles defense. But he was also special against the LA Rams and the LA Chargers. If you guys didn't check out how good Dak was in those games, I plead you guys to go look at the film in those past 3 games. Just don't watch the 49ers game because that one was bad. But over the course of the last 3 weeks, it really looks like Dak is getting more confident in this offensive system that Mike McCarthy has built. So I'm excited to see how he can translate his level of performance these past 3 weeks over the course of the rest of the season, because this is a Cowboys team that has kind of a rough schedule at the end of the season, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Another huge positive that I did want to mention as well has been CeeDee Lamb. On the year, he has 57 catches for 824 yards and 3 touchdowns. While I feel like the touchdown numbers are pretty low, he always does a really solid job of getting that team down towards the red zone. And similar to Dak Prescott, over the course of the last 3 games, he's had over 110 yards in each game and over 7 catches in each game as well. And that Dak Prescott to CeeDee Lamb connection has been huge over the course of the last 3 weeks. My one concern about this situation though with Dallas is that because this offense is so reliant upon CeeDee Lamb to be special, what happens when CeeDee Lamb can't be special? What happens when they go up against a defense that knows to double coverage CeeDee Lamb and doesn't allow him to get yards after catch? Who is Dak going to go to after that? I think that's when you're going to need guys like Jake Ferguson, Brandon Cooks, Tony Pollard to really step up. And while that hasn't been an issue over the course of the last 3 weeks, we also haven't seen any of those guys outside of Jake Ferguson really step up, which I will talk about Jake Ferguson real quickly as well, because last night was his best game of his entire career. And for the most part this year, he's been a pretty good safety valve for Dak Prescott to go to. He definitely is not a Travis Kelce level player, but he's definitely gotten better each week. So I definitely do think his future is bright with the Dallas Cowboys. And I also did want to briefly mention that I think Tony Pollard is going to get better as the season goes on. I would love for this Dallas Cowboys offense to start featuring guys like Rico Dowell, Malik Davis, maybe Deuce Vaughn at some point, because right now I just think the workload that Tony Pollard is working with, it might be a little bit too high. I think you can have Tony Pollard out there for 60% of the snaps and have those combinations of other running backs for about 40% of the time. I would also like to see Malik Davis or whoever they decide to go to have certain drives where they just run the ball with them and allow those guys to have a little bit more wear and tear on their game. Let's actually answer the question. Dallas contenders or frauds? Well, let's look at the entire NFC real quickly. The Seattle Seahawks, they're not contenders. They got exposed last night by the Ravens. I don't think they're true contenders in the NFC. The Detroit Lions, I do think that's a contending team, but they haven't really beaten any good teams. And when they have gone up against good teams, they haven't really looked that great, outside of course, that Kansas City Chiefs game early on this year. The San Francisco 49ers, while I consider them to still be contenders, they've looked a little bit fraudulent ever since they beat the Dallas Cowboys. That being said, I do imagine this team is going to get back in the winning track, but they also have some tough matchups still ahead, so we'll kind of have to wait and see on that 49ers team to see if they're true contenders. And of course, Philadelphia, we all know that is a true contending team. That Philadelphia Eagles offense and defense is just special. I do think though that Dallas stacks up very well against them, and I actually do think the Dallas Cowboys will beat them the next time they play each other. So for myself, I still think that Dallas is a contending team. I know they got smothered by the San Francisco 49ers earlier this season, and that definitely does put a bit of a stinker on their season thus far. And I understand this Cowboys team hasn't really gone out there and beat any good teams outside of the LA Chargers, but I do think as the season goes on, they'll have matchups against the Eagles again, the Seahawks, the Buffalo Bills, the Dolphins, the Lions. Those are games that Dallas can really prove that they are true contenders. And I think of in those 5 games that I mentioned earlier, if they can win 3 of those 5 games, I think you can still be pretty happy with that. I think the likelihood they'll win the NFC is pretty far-fetched. I think the same thing kind of applies for the NFC East. I think it's a little bit too far out of hands at this point. So you're going to be looking at the wild card, which I don't really think is a bad thing, honestly. If you go in there as the 5th seed, you're going to have a pretty easy wild card weekend. You'll probably end up going against a team like the Buccaneers, the Atlanta Falcons, some team like that, which Dallas should be able to handle pretty easily. And then in your next match, you'll probably go up against the number 1 seed, which I think will probably be the Eagles. And if you're Dallas, you got to feel really confident about that. So I do think that Dallas has a certain route that they can go to get to the Super Bowl. They're definitely going to need a lot of things to go their way. One of the biggest things that they're going to need moving forward is that defense to continue to be stout. They're also going to need that Dak to CD connection to be as great as it has been over the course of the last couple weeks. And they finally got to get this offensive line and run game going. But that is everything I have for you guys. If I didn't mention something that you guys want to talk about, let me know in the comment section below. I do have more NFL content coming out every single week, so if you do enjoy that type of stuff, make sure to like and subscribe, as well as share this video to your friends and family who might enjoy it as well. But I love you guys. Peace.